You'll work the bar during cocktail hour, then help serve dinner, Aunt Patricia said, not looking up from her phone as she scrolled through what I assumed were seating charts or floral arrangements or some other expensive detail of Vanessa's upcoming wedding. We were sitting at her dining room table, the kind of solid mahogany monstrosity that cost more than 6 months of my rent, surrounded by the sort of casual wealth I'd grown up adjacent to but never quite part of. My mother shifted uncomfortably beside me, and I could feel her silent apology radiating across the space between us. But she said nothing, would say nothing, because Patricia was her older sister, and this was just how things were in our family. "It'll be good experience for you," Patricia continued, finally glancing up with that particular smile that never reached her eyes, the one that said she was doing me a tremendous favor by allowing me to exist in her orbit. "Vanessa's inviting several people from the hospitality industry, and you never know who you might meet. Networking is everything, sweetie." The endearment landed like a slap, sticky sweet and condescending, and I felt something twist in my chest, that familiar combination of hurt and humiliation I'd been swallowing down since childhood. I was 27 years old, 3 years deep into my doctoral program, working 2 jobs to keep myself afloat while I finished my dissertation, surviving on 4 hours of sleep and the kind of determination that came from knowing no one was going to hand me anything. Patricia knew this, or she would have known it if she'd ever bothered to ask, but to her I was still just her poor sister's daughter, the one who needed guidance and opportunities, and apparently experience serving drinks at family weddings. "I'm not sure I can take the time off," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice level and failing to keep the exhaustion out of it entirely. "I have my research assistantship and the tutoring sessions I coordinate, and I'm really at a critical point with my dissertation." Patricia waved her hand dismissively, a gesture that somehow managed to erase months of my careful work and planning. "Oh, I'm sure your professors will understand. It's family. Besides, this is Vanessa's special day, and she specifically requested you." I doubted that very much, knowing my cousin's opinion of me had never risen above vague disdain mixed with pity, but I also knew what this really was. Free labor, dressed up as opportunity. My aunt's particular specialty when it came to dealing with the less fortunate branches of the family tree. My mother reached over and squeezed my hand under the table, a gesture that was meant to be comforting, but felt more like a plea for me not to make waves, not to cause problems, to just go along with what Patricia wanted, because that was easier than confronting the casual cruelty that had characterized our family dynamics for as long as I could remember. Before continuing the story, please subscribe. I need to reach 1,000 subscribers to be able to bring you stories like this every day. For you, it's just a click, but for me, it means a lot. The pattern had started so early I could barely remember a time before it, back when I was 8 years old and Vanessa was 10, when Patricia had hosted a Christmas party and spent the entire evening pointing out how beautifully Vanessa played piano while I sat in the corner with a book, not mentioning that I'd just won the regional spelling bee or that my teachers had recommended me for the gifted program. Vanessa's piano playing was mediocre at best, something even I could recognize at 8, but Patricia had hired the best instructors and the most expensive instrument, and that investment needed to be showcased, needed to be validated, while my academic achievements cost nothing and therefore meant nothing in the calculus of worth that governed my aunt's worldview. The comparison became a constant refrain throughout my childhood and adolescence. Vanessa's every minor accomplishment celebrated with elaborate parties and expensive gifts, while my genuine successes were met with distracted nods and comments about how book-smart I was, as if intelligence without wealth was some kind of unfortunate genetic mutation to be politely ignored. When Vanessa barely graduated from a mediocre private college with a communications degree after 6 years and 3 major changes, Patricia threw her a party at the country club and gave her a new Mercedes, but when I graduated summa cum laude from state school with a double major in 3.5 years while working 20 hours a week, I got a card with $50 and a comment about how I must be exhausted from working so hard, the implication being that my exhaustion was somehow my own fault, a consequence of not having the resources that proper planning and better choices would have provided. My parents had done their best, both working steady, middle-class jobs, my father in middle management at a manufacturing company, and my mother as a nurse. But they'd never had Patricia's advantages, never made the kind of strategic marriage she had when she met Richard Thornton at some charity function and quickly secured herself a position in a tax bracket that changed everything about how she moved through the world. The financial gap became a chasm that Patricia wielded like a weapon, every family gathering an opportunity to remind us of what we lacked. Every gift to me and my younger brother carefully calculated to be just slightly less than what she spent on Vanessa. Every invitation contingent on our willingness to play our assigned roles in her carefully constructed social hierarchy. I remembered being excluded from Vanessa's Sweet 16 because Patricia said it was too sophisticated for younger cousins, even though I was only 14 and perfectly capable of attending a party. But 2 years later, when she needed help setting up for some fundraiser, I was suddenly old enough to be useful, old enough to spend 6 hours arranging gift bags and setting up chairs while Vanessa got her hair done. The message was always clear and never explicitly stated. I existed in Patricia's world to serve a function, to be useful when needed and invisible when not, to provide contrast that made Vanessa look better by comparison, to be the example of what happened when you didn't marry well, or plan properly, or have the good sense to be born into better circumstances. 2 weeks before the wedding, Patricia called me directly instead of going through my mother, which should have been my first warning that the demands were about to escalate beyond what even family obligation could reasonably excuse. "I've been thinking about the service flow," she said without preamble, her voice carrying that brisk efficiency she used when delegating tasks to people she considered staff. "And we're going to need you for the full day, not just cocktail hour. The catering company is providing the kitchen staff, but we need someone to coordinate the floor service, make sure the champagne keeps flowing, handle the gift table, that sort of thing." I was standing in my apartment kitchen, surrounded by stacks of research materials and 3 days' worth of coffee cups, trying to calculate how many hours I'd need to request off from both my assistantship and my evening tutoring job, and the number kept getting larger with each additional responsibility Patricia added to the list. "I'm not sure I can take the entire day," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, even as I felt anger starting to build in my chest, hot and familiar. "I have students who depend on the tutoring sessions, and Dr. Morrison needs me in the lab that week for the data analysis phase." Patricia made a sound that might have been a laugh if it had contained any actual humor. "Surely they can manage without you for one day. This is your cousin's wedding, it's important. And honestly, I think you're not seeing what an opportunity this is for you." There was that word again, opportunity, as if being treated like hired help by my own family was some kind of gift I should be grateful for. "It would really mean a lot to Vanessa," Patricia continued, "and I knew this was the closer, the appeal to family loyalty that was supposed to make me forget that Vanessa had barely spoken to me in 3 years, except to make dismissive comments about graduate students and their lack of real-world experience. And of course there's no question of paying you, your family, but think of it as networking. As I said before, you'll meet people who could be valuable contacts." The assumption that I should donate an entire day of my time, sacrifice income I desperately needed, disrupt work that actually mattered to my future, all for the vague promise of meeting people in Vanessa's social circle who would see me as exactly what I was being positioned as, the poor relation. Doing service work made something crack inside me. But my mother had already called twice that week, her voice tight with stress, asking me to please just do this, to not make things difficult, to remember that family was important even when family didn't treat us the way we deserved. And I was so tired of being the one who always had to be understanding, who always had to bend, who always had to swallow down hurt and humiliation for the sake of keeping peace. "Fine," I heard myself say, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. "I'll be there." Patricia's relief was audible and entirely self-centered, No acknowledgement of what I was sacrificing. Just immediate transition into logistics about what I should wear and when I should arrive, and a reminder to make sure I looked presentable because appearances mattered at an event like this. After I hung up, I stood in my kitchen for a long time, staring at my dissertation materials spread across the counter, physical evidence of work that Patricia had never once asked about, achievements she had never acknowledged, a future she couldn't even imagine I was building because it existed so far outside her understanding of who I was allowed to be in her world. The Thornton Country Club sat on 200 acres of manicured grounds just outside the city, all rolling lawns and pristine gardens, and a clubhouse that looked like it had been imported stone by stone from some European estate. And driving up the long entrance road that morning, I felt my stomach twist with a nausea that had nothing to do with the early hour and everything to do with what I was about to endure. I parked in the service lot like Patricia had instructed, not the guest parking, and this small detail felt like a physical blow, even though I'd known it was coming. This literal separation between the people who mattered and the people who served them. Patricia had left the uniform in a garment bag at my apartment 3 days earlier. Black pants and a crisp white button-down shirt with a black vest. Professional server attire that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, but was still unmistakably a uniform, still unmistakably marking me as staff. I changed in the service entrance bathroom, catching sight of myself in the mirror and barely recognizing the person looking back. Someone who looked small and diminished and erased, someone who existed only to fulfill a function. The wedding coordinator, a brisk woman named Michelle who treated me with the casual authority she'd use with any hired worker, gave me my assignments for the day, and I noticed she never once asked my name or made eye contact, and I wondered if Patricia had even told her I was family, or if that detail was too complicated to explain, too likely to raise questions about why a family member was working instead of celebrating. My Uncle James, my father's brother, arrived with his wife Carol, and I watched his face register confusion when he saw me in uniform. Watched him start to approach before Carol grabbed his arm and whispered something that made him stop, and the pity in his expression was somehow worse than Patricia's casual cruelty. Vanessa swept through in the late morning for some kind of bridal emergency, looking like a princess in her getting-ready robe with her hair already partially styled, and when she saw me carrying a tray of champagne flutes to the bridal suite, she actually laughed. This bright, delighted sound like she'd just witnessed the most amusing thing. "Oh, this is perfect," she said to her bridesmaids, not lowering her voice at all. Patricia actually got her to do it. I didn't think she'd really agree, but I guess some people will do anything for free food and a chance to see how the other half lives. The bridesmaids giggled, these women I'd met at various family functions over the years, women who'd made polite conversation with me when I was introduced as Vanessa's cousin, but now looked through me like I was furniture. I kept my face neutral and my eyes down, something I'd learned from years of enduring Patricia's casual cruelty, this ability to simply disappear inside myself while my body went through the required motions. By early afternoon, my feet ached in the dress shoes Patricia had insisted I wear, proper service footwear she'd called it, and my face hurt from maintaining a pleasant neutral expression. And I'd already been snapped at twice by Patricia for minor infractions I'm not even sure I actually committed, once for placing champagne glasses on the wrong side of a place setting, and once for not moving quickly enough when she needed something from the bridal suite. The breaking point came during the reception, when the ballroom was full of 200 guests in evening wear, and the champagne was flowing and the string quartet was playing something classical and expensive sounding, and I was moving through the crowd with a tray of hors d'oeuvres that cost more per piece than my hourly tutoring rate. Patricia had been monitoring me all evening with the hypercritical attention she usually reserved for scrutinizing Vanessa's various boyfriends, and I'd felt her eyes tracking me across the room multiple times, waiting for me to make a mistake significant enough to justify whatever correction she was storing up. The mistake, when it came, was barely a mistake at all, just a moment of physics and bad timing when I was serving drinks to a group of Patricia's friends near the head table, and someone shifted suddenly and bumped my elbow, and a single champagne flute tilted, spilling maybe 2 ounces of liquid onto the edge of a tablecloth that was already destined for professional cleaning. Patricia descended on me before I could even set down the tray, her face composed in that expression of patient disappointment she'd perfected over years of making people feel small, and her voice carried across the immediate area in a way that made nearby conversations falter and heads turn. "This is exactly why I wanted professional coordination," she said, not to me but to the woman standing beside her, some friend or business associate in a dress that probably cost what I paid in rent for 3 months. Speaking as though I wasn't even there, or was perhaps an object incapable of hearing or feeling. Family obligations are so complicated. You try to help someone out, give them opportunities they wouldn't otherwise have, and they can't even manage basic competence. The woman made some sympathetic noise, her eyes flicking to me with a mix of pity and secondhand embarrassment, and I felt my face flush hot with humiliation that went beyond embarrassment into something darker and more corrosive. I opened my mouth to respond, to defend myself, to point out that the spill was minor and accidental, and that I'd been working for 7 straight hours fulfilling duties that had expanded far beyond what Patricia had originally described. But the words caught in my throat because I knew that anything I said would only make things worse, would only confirm Patricia's narrative that I was difficult and ungrateful and incapable of appreciating what was being done for me. Instead, I murmured an apology that tasted like poison, set down the tray with hands that were shaking slightly, and retreated to the service corridor behind the kitchen where the real catering staff took their breaks. A fluorescent-lit hallway that smelled like industrial cleaning solution, and where I could finally let my face show what I was feeling. I leaned against the wall and fought back tears that were equal parts humiliation and rage, my mind replaying Patricia's words and tone and the casual cruelty of speaking about me as though I was both present and irrelevant, as though my feelings and dignity were simply not factors worth considering. For a long moment, I genuinely considered leaving, just walking out to my car and driving away and letting Patricia explain my absence however she wanted, but I knew that would only give her ammunition, would only confirm every dismissive thing she'd ever thought about me, would only prove to my mother that I'd made things difficult like she'd been afraid I would. So instead, I stayed there in that hallway, breathing carefully and deliberately, making a promise to myself that I would never again put myself in a position where Patricia or anyone else could treat me this way, that this humiliation would be the last one I accepted, that I would build a life so successful and independent and complete that her opinion and her approval and her version of opportunity would become completely irrelevant to my sense of worth or my measure of success. What Patricia didn't know, what none of them knew, because I'd been carefully quiet about it for reasons that mixed superstition with privacy and a deep desire to keep the most important parts of my life separate from their judgment, was that while I was serving champagne in a uniform that marked me as lesser, I was 3 months away from defending a doctoral dissertation in computational logistics optimization that had already attracted interest from multiple industry leaders who actually understood its value. My research focused on supply chain efficiency in pharmaceutical distribution, a specialized field that sat at the intersection of data science, healthcare economics, and operations management. And over the past 18 months, I developed an algorithm that could reduce medication delivery costs by up to 40% while improving speed and reliability. Work that had caught the attention of several major consulting firms and healthcare companies who'd been courting me since I'd presented preliminary findings at a conference in Boston the previous fall. I had 3 formal job offers already in hand, the lowest starting at $165,000 and the highest at $185,000. Positions that would have made Patricia's patronizing talk of networking opportunities laughable if I'd had any interest in explaining the reality of my professional trajectory to someone who'd already decided I was worth less than the help she actually paid. The networking Patricia imagined I needed, her country club friends and business associates who treated service workers as invisible, was so far removed from the actual professional connections I'd been building that it existed in a completely different universe, Because while she was planning Vanessa's elaborate wedding, I was corresponding with the former Surgeon General about a collaboration, having coffee meetings with venture capitalists interested in healthcare technology, and getting emails from recruiters at McKinsey and Deloitte who wanted to discuss senior analyst positions that came with signing bonuses larger than my mother's annual salary. I'd kept all of this quiet, partly because talking about unfinished work felt like tempting fate, like I might jinx the dissertation defense or somehow sabotage the careful academic and professional progress I'd been making, but mostly because I'd learned over years of Patricia's dismissiveness that sharing my achievements with this particular segment of my family only invited comparison to Vanessa, or dismissal as somehow less legitimate than whatever conventional markers of success they understood. My parents knew, of course, they'd celebrated every milestone with the kind of proud recognition that made their limited financial support feel more valuable than all of Patricia's wealth, but I'd asked them to keep details private from the extended family until everything was finalized, until the degree was actually conferred and the job actually started, and they'd respected that request, even though I knew my mother especially wanted to share news that proved her daughter's worth to relatives who'd spent years suggesting otherwise. Standing in that service corridor with my face still hot from Patricia's public humiliation, I held on to the knowledge of my almost completed doctorate, like a talisman against her cruelty, reminding myself that in 3 months I would defend my dissertation, in 4 months I would graduate, in 5 months I would start a position that paid more than Patricia probably imagined someone like me could earn, and that the opinion of someone who measured worth in country club memberships and designer labels would become completely irrelevant to any measure of success that actually mattered. The next morning, there was a family brunch at Patricia's house, one of those post-wedding gatherings she'd planned as an extension of the celebration, and my mother had insisted I attend despite my strong preference to never see any of those people again, citing family obligation and the fact that my absence would be noticed and remarked upon in ways that would somehow reflect poorly on her. I arrived tired and still carrying the emotional residue of the previous night's humiliation, my body aching from 7 hours of physical labor that none of them would acknowledge as such, and found the house full of relatives and close friends, picking over an elaborate catered spread that had probably cost more than I'd earn in a month of teaching assistantship work. Patricia was holding court in the living room, still wearing the glow of successful hostess, accepting compliments on the wedding with the gracious modesty of someone who'd orchestrated something truly special. And when she saw me, she didn't say thank you or acknowledge the work I'd done, or even offer the basic courtesy of asking how I was feeling. Instead, she launched into a critique of my performance that she framed as constructive feedback, telling me in front of my mother and two of her friends that I'd seemed overwhelmed by the responsibilities and that next time I should speak up if something was too much for me rather than struggling through with visible stress, as though my exhaustion and frustration had been personal failings rather than reasonable responses to unreasonable demands. Vanessa appeared from the kitchen with a mimosa in hand, still basking in newlywed attention, and joined her mother's assessment with the casual cruelty that came so naturally to both of them, saying something about how serving really wasn't for everyone, and that it took a special skill set to make it look effortless, the implication clear that I lacked whatever quality separated adequate help from good help. I stood there absorbing their criticism with a blank expression that I'd learned to wear like armor, saying nothing because I knew that defending myself would only invite more judgment, would only give them more ammunition, would only confirm their belief that I was difficult and oversensitive and unable to accept feedback gracefully. My mother looked uncomfortable but said nothing, caught as always between loyalty to me and her desire to maintain peace with her wealthier sister, and I felt a flash of frustration with her complicity, even as I understood the complicated family dynamics that made her intervention difficult. I stayed for exactly 45 minutes, long enough that my early departure couldn't be called rude, but short enough that I didn't have to endure much more of their company, and when I left I felt a sense of relief so profound it was almost physical, like I'd been holding my breath underwater and had finally surfaced. I drove back to my small apartment across town, back to my real life with my research and my actual friends and my future that had nothing to do with Patricia's version of opportunity, and I made a quiet promise to myself that I would use every bit of anger and humiliation from this weekend as fuel, that I would channel everything I was feeling into the final push to complete my dissertation, that I would take every dismissive word and condescending look and transform it into motivation to build something so successful and independent that their opinions would become not just irrelevant, but absurd. I spent the rest of that Sunday working on Chapter 6 of my dissertation, refining the algorithm that would eventually become the foundation of my professional reputation. And with every hour I spent on work that actually mattered, I felt the weekend's humiliation recede into something smaller and more manageable, something that hurt less because I knew it was temporary, something I could endure because I knew exactly how temporary it would be. 3 months later, I stood in a small auditorium at the university, facing a panel of 4 professors who would determine whether 5 years of research and analysis and countless sleepless nights would culminate in the 3 letters that would change everything about how the world saw me and how I saw myself. And I defended my dissertation on computational logistics optimization in pharmaceutical supply chains with a clarity and confidence that came partly from knowing the work was genuinely excellent, and partly from having channeled 3 months of anger and humiliation into preparation so thorough that I could have answered their questions in my sleep. The defense lasted 2 hours and 14 minutes, and when the committee chair asked me to step outside while they deliberated, I stood in the hallway with my advisor, Dr. Richardson, who'd guided me through the entire doctoral process, and she told me she'd never seen a defense that strong, that I should be proud regardless of the outcome, though she had no doubt what that outcome would be. They called me back in after 12 minutes, and the committee chair said, "Congratulations, doctor." And I felt something shift fundamentally in my chest. Some combination of relief and triumph, and the sudden crystallization of an identity I'd been working toward for so long, it had started to feel theoretical rather than achievable. My parents came to the small celebration dinner that night at a restaurant near campus, and my father cried, which he almost never did, and my mother kept calling me doctor with this proud emphasis that made me laugh, even as my own eyes filled with tears, and my closest friends from the doctoral program were there. People who'd supported me through every stage of the research and who understood exactly what this achievement meant in ways that Patricia and Vanessa never could or would. I didn't invite anyone from Patricia's side of the family, and I didn't post about it on social media where they might see it, because this moment belonged to me and to the people who'd actually valued me when I had nothing to prove, and I wasn't interested in sharing it with relatives who'd spent years making clear that my achievements didn't register as worthy of their attention. 2 weeks after the defense, I accepted the position at Synthesis Health Analytics in Chicago, a prestigious healthcare consulting firm where my research had direct application to their client work, and the offer letter specified a starting salary of $180,000 plus a $25,000 signing bonus plus benefits that included everything from premium health insurance to professional development funds. Numbers that represented not just financial security, but validation of the expertise I'd spent years developing, while Patricia treated me as unskilled labor suitable only for serving her guests. I gave notice at my teaching assistantship and my weekend research position, packed up my modest student apartment that I'd lived in for 4 years, and drove to Chicago on a sunny morning in early September with everything I owned in a rented truck and a feeling of lightness I hadn't experienced in longer than I could remember, like I was physically leaving behind not just a city, but an entire version of myself that had been constrained by other people's limited perception of my worth. 6 months after the wedding, I was living in a spacious 2-bedroom apartment in Chicago's River North neighborhood with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline, the kind of place I used to imagine successful people lived in, without ever quite believing I'd be one of them. And every morning I woke up in that light-filled space with a feeling of profound gratitude that this was actually my life now, not some temporary fantasy, but the solid reality I'd built through years of work that Patricia had never bothered to notice or value. Synthesis. Health analytics had been everything the recruitment materials promised and more. A fast-paced environment where my specialized expertise in pharmaceutical supply chain optimization wasn't just appreciated but actively sought after, where senior partners asked my opinion in client meetings, and my analyses directly shaped multi-million-dollar recommendations. And within 4 months of starting, I'd been promoted from consultant to senior consultant, with a corresponding salary increase to $240,000 that felt both surreal and entirely earned given the complexity of the work I was producing. The promotion came with a corner office on the 23rd floor and my own dedicated project team, tangible markers of professional respect that stood in sharp contrast to the way Patricia had treated me as interchangeable with hired waitstaff. And I found myself thinking about that contrast during quiet moments at my desk, marveling at how thoroughly my circumstances had transformed while she presumably continued believing I was still struggling through graduate school with no prospects beyond academic obscurity. I was working with clients across the healthcare industry, major pharmaceutical manufacturers and hospital systems, and pharmacy benefit managers, helping them optimize their logistics operations in ways that saved millions in costs, while improving patient access to critical medications, and the work felt genuinely meaningful in ways that went beyond the excellent compensation, gave me a sense that my expertise was contributing to something larger than just corporate profit margins. My colleagues were brilliant and driven people who treated me as an intellectual equal, who invited me to lunch and happy hours and weekend social gatherings, who created the kind of professional community I'd always imagined but hadn't quite experienced during the isolating years of doctoral research, and I built friendships with several other senior consultants who became real friends outside of work. People who knew nothing about Patricia or Vanessa or the wedding humiliation, because that chapter of my life had no relevance to the person I was becoming in Chicago. The networking opportunities that Patricia had dangled as justification for unpaid labor at Vanessa's wedding, the promise of meeting important people and making valuable connections, had materialized in my actual professional life without any assistance from her social circle, because it turned out that genuine expertise and demonstrable competence created their own networking opportunities far more valuable than anything her country club connections could have offered. I furnished my apartment with care, investing in quality pieces that reflected my own taste rather than trying to impress anyone, created a home office where I could work comfortably on the occasional evening or weekend when project deadlines demanded extra hours, and established a life in Chicago that felt authentically mine in ways my graduate school existence never quite had, built on my own achievement rather than inherited family connections or social positioning. I maintained minimal contact with extended family during those months, responding politely to my mother's weekly calls, but keeping the conversations focused on her life rather than providing detailed updates about mine, and I never mentioned the promotion or the salary increase or the apartment or any of the professional recognition I was receiving because I'd learned that sharing my successes with my mother inevitably meant those details would reach Patricia, and I wasn't interested in giving her the opportunity to dismiss or minimize, or find some way to make my achievements about her judgment of their adequacy. 8 months into my position at Synthesis Health Analytics, I was invited to present at the Healthcare Supply Chain Innovation Summit in Boston, a major industry conference that drew executives and thought leaders from across the pharmaceutical and healthcare logistics sectors. And the invitation came because a case study I'd authored about implementing predictive modeling for vaccine distribution had been published in the Journal of Healthcare Operations Management, a peer-reviewed publication that was considered the gold standard in the field and represented exactly the kind of academic industry crossover that validated my decision to pursue applied research rather than traditional academic positions. The conference presentation was scheduled for a 90-minute slot in the main ballroom, not a breakout session, but a featured presentation that would draw several hundred attendees, and I spent 3 weeks preparing slides and rehearsing the delivery because I knew this was the kind of visibility that could establish me as a recognized expert rather than just a competent consultant, the difference between being someone who did good work and someone whose name people knew when they needed the best person in the field. I flew to Boston on a Tuesday morning in early April, and the conference organizers had arranged accommodation at the venue hotel and covered all expenses, treating me with a level of professional courtesy that still felt remarkable compared to the years of graduate school poverty when I'd had to carefully budget for every conference registration fee and shared cheap hotel rooms with other students to afford attendance at far smaller academic gatherings. The presentation went better than I'd hoped. The audience engaged in asking sophisticated questions that indicated they genuinely followed the technical complexity of the methodology, and afterward, I was approached by at least 24 people who wanted to discuss potential applications to their organizations or simply tell me they'd found the work insightful, including a senior vice president from one of the largest pharmaceutical manufacturers in the country who handed me her card and said they should talk about consulting opportunities because they were struggling with exactly the supply chain challenges I'd addressed. Within 3 weeks of the conference, I had speaking invitations from 2 other industry events and an interview request from Healthcare Innovation Quarterly, a trade publication that profiled emerging leaders and innovative approaches in the healthcare sector. And the interview was published in their June issue with a professional headshot and a 2-page spread that quoted me extensively on the future of pharmaceutical logistics and identified me as one of the field's most promising young experts bringing academic rigor to practical industry. Challenges. I still maintained minimal contact with Patricia's side of the family during this period, my life in Chicago feeling increasingly separate from the family dynamics that had defined my earlier years. And I never mentioned the conference presentation, or the journal publication, or the trade magazine profile to my mother, because those achievements existed in a professional sphere that had nothing to do with family validation and everything to do with the respect of people whose opinions actually carried weight in my field, people who evaluated me based on the quality of my work, rather than their preconceived notions about my worth relative to someone like Vanessa. While I was building my professional life in Chicago and establishing my reputation in healthcare supply chain optimization, Patricia and her husband Richard were dealing with a very different kind of transformation. Though I wouldn't learn the details until much later, when the full picture became clear through a combination of my mother's reluctant updates and information that emerged during subsequent events. Richard's business, a mid-sized pharmaceutical distribution company that had provided the foundation for their wealth and funded the lifestyle Patricia had wielded like a weapon to establish her superiority over my middle-class parents, was facing serious challenges from market consolidation and regulatory changes that were squeezing profit margins across the entire sector. And while they weren't in immediate danger of bankruptcy or losing their house or anything quite that dramatic, the comfortable assumption of endless financial security that had underwritten Patricia's condescension for decades was suddenly looking much less certain. The company had been profitable for years through a combination of regional relationships and operational practices that worked well in a less competitive environment. But larger national distributors were expanding into their territory with economies of scale that Richard's operation couldn't match. And new regulations around pharmaceutical supply chain transparency were requiring technology investments and compliance measures that were expensive to implement and cut directly into the margins that had sustained their lifestyle. Richard was in his early 60s and had been talking about succession planning and gradual retirement, perhaps selling the business to a larger competitor or passing it to professional management while retaining ownership. But those plans assumed the company would maintain its value and profitability, and the current trajectory was threatening both. With several potential acquirers who'd expressed interest in previous years now pointing to margin compression and operational inefficiencies as reasons to substantially lower their offers or withdraw interest entirely. Patricia, who had never worked outside the home and whose identity was deeply tied to the social position that Richard's wealth provided, was watching their financial security erode without having any professional skills or experience that might help address the situation. And for the first time in decades, she was confronting the possibility that the lifestyle she'd taken for granted might require actual sacrifice or adjustment. That the effortless superiority she'd projected over people like my parents might have been built on a less stable foundation than she'd believed. Vanessa wasn't helping matters, having married a man from a similar social background whose own family business was facing comparable pressures, and her expensive tastes and expectations for maintaining a certain lifestyle were adding financial strain rather than relief. With Patricia and Richard still subsidizing various aspects of their daughter's life in ways that were becoming increasingly difficult to sustain. I learned later that Richard had been consulting with various business advisors and industry contacts trying to find solutions, looking for ways to modernize operations and improve efficiency and compete more effectively with the larger distributors. And multiple people had apparently told him that what he really needed was expertise in pharmaceutical supply chain optimization. Someone who understood both the operational logistics and the regulatory environment and could conduct a comprehensive analysis of where the inefficiencies existed and how to address them. But that specialized expertise was expensive and difficult to find because it required a combination of technical knowledge and industry experience that very few consultants possessed. Patricia discovered my professional identity in the most mundane way possible, through a copy of Healthcare Innovation Quarterly that Richard brought home from a business meeting where someone had referenced an article about pharmaceutical supply chain optimization. And she told me later that she'd been flipping through the magazine absently while Richard was on a phone call, not really paying attention until she saw a photograph that looked disturbingly familiar, and the shock of recognition when she realized she was looking at a professional headshot of me, her niece, who she'd last seen wearing a server's uniform and carrying trays of champagne at Vanessa's wedding, was apparently profound enough that she actually gasped out loud and had to read the accompanying article 3 times before she could fully process what she was seeing. The article identified me as Dr. Emily Chen, senior consultant at Synthesis Health Analytics, and quoted me extensively about emerging trends in pharmaceutical logistics and supply chain transparency, using language and demonstrating expertise that made clear this wasn't some entry-level position or minor accomplishment, but rather significant professional authority in exactly the field that Richard desperately needed help with. And Patricia later admitted that her first reaction was complete disbelief, a certainty that this had to be a different person with the same name because the niece she knew was a perpetual student who'd been grateful for the opportunity to serve drinks and gain experience at a family wedding, not someone who'd earned a doctorate and built a respected consulting career and got profiled in industry publications as an emerging expert. She showed the article to Richard, who apparently stared at it for a long time before asking several questions about whether she was certain this was the same Emily, whether I'd really completed a PhD, whether this was a legitimate publication and a real position, and Patricia found herself in the strange position of having to confirm that yes, her niece, who she'd treated as essentially unskilled labor, suitable only for serving relatives at family events, was in fact the exact type of specialized expert that multiple business advisors had told them they needed to hire. Someone with advanced academic credentials and practical industry experience in pharmaceutical supply chain optimization, who could analyze their operational inefficiencies and recommend solutions. Patricia spent the next several days doing what she later described as research, but what was really a deep dive into my professional background, fueled by a mixture of shocked curiosity and desperate hope. Finding my profile on Synthesis Health Analytics website with my credentials and publications listed, discovering my LinkedIn profile that documented my education and career progression and showed connections to numerous industry leaders, locating my published journal articles and conference presentations, and gradually constructing a picture of professional success that was completely at odds with the dismissive understanding she'd maintained of my worth and potential. The cognitive dissonance must have been extraordinary. reconciling the image of me in a server's uniform, being snapped at for minor mistakes with the professional headshot and impressive credentials and respected expertise that her research revealed. And I imagine there was a period where Patricia had to sit with the uncomfortable realization that she'd been profoundly wrong in her assessment of my capabilities, and that the condescension she'd shown me for years had been directed at someone who was not only competent, but actually more professionally accomplished in a relevant field than anyone in her immediate family. The discovery also meant confronting the fact that when she'd offered me networking opportunities by serving at Vanessa's wedding, I'd already been building a genuine professional network with actual industry leaders. That when she'd treated me as someone who should be grateful for family connections and exposure to her social circle, I'd been operating in professional spheres where people knew my name because of my expertise rather than my family relationships, and that the entire framework of superiority she'd maintained was built on ignorance about who I actually was and what I'd actually achieved. The email arrived on a Tuesday afternoon while I was reviewing preliminary findings for a healthcare system client in Milwaukee, and I almost missed it entirely because it came to my professional contact address rather than personal email. And the subject line read, "Consultation request, pharmaceutical distribution," without any indication of the sender's identity until I opened it and saw the signature block that made my heart skip in a way I hadn't anticipated. Patricia Whitmore, on behalf of Whitmore Pharmaceutical Distribution. I sat very still at my desk for a long moment, reading the message once, then again, then a third time, as I processed both what it said and what it so carefully didn't say. The email was professionally formatted and written in business language that Patricia had clearly labored over, or possibly had Richard review, requesting consultation services for operational optimization and regulatory compliance assessment for their pharmaceutical distribution company, explaining that they'd been referred to my expertise by industry contacts and had read my published work and believed I would be an excellent fit for their needs, and wondering about my availability and standard engagement terms for a comprehensive supply chain analysis. It was perfectly polite and appropriately professional, exactly the kind of initial inquiry I received regularly from potential clients, except that it came from a woman who 14 months earlier had handed me a server's uniform and told me that carrying trays at her daughter's wedding would be valuable experience and a networking opportunity I should be grateful to receive, who had snapped at me in front of guests for a minor mistake and never once thanked me for sacrificing my time and dignity to perform unpaid labor at her family event, who had spent my entire life treating me as lesser and making clear through 1,000 small cruelties that I was the poor relation whose presence was tolerated rather than valued. What struck me most was what the email didn't contain. No acknowledgement of our family relationship beyond the shared last name that she couldn't avoid using. No reference to our history, or the wedding, or any personal connection. No apology, or even passing recognition that requesting professional services from someone you'd treated as servant labor might require some addressing of past behavior. Just a straightforward business inquiry that assumed I would of course be willing to help because that's what family does. Or perhaps because she genuinely didn't recognize that treating me as hired help and then asking me to provide expert consultation might be experienced as anything other than a normal request. I felt a strange cocktail of emotions as I stared at that email. Vindication, certainly, the sharp satisfaction of having my professional worth acknowledged by someone who'd dismissed it so thoroughly, but also anger at the presumption that she could simply reach out as though nothing had happened. Bitter amusement at the role reversal that had her seeking my expertise rather than offering me opportunities. And underneath it all, a deeper hurt that even now, even when asking for my help, she couldn't bring herself to acknowledge me as a person she'd wronged rather than just a professional resource she needed to access. I saved the email to a folder without responding, closing my laptop and sitting back in my chair as I contemplated what response, if any, this request deserved, and what it meant that the vindication I'd imagined in abstract terms during those long months of dissertation work, had arrived in my inbox, wearing the bland professional language of a business inquiry. I let Patricia's initial email sit unanswered for a full week, going about my regular work and life while that message remained in my inbox like a small stone I could feel the weight of, but wasn't ready to pick up and examine. And I told myself I was simply too busy with client commitments to respond immediately, though the truth was I needed time to process what I was feeling and decide what kind of response this situation deserved. On day 6, after the initial email, a second message arrived, and the tone had shifted noticeably from professional inquiry to something more urgent, the business language less polished, and the request more direct. They really needed help soon. Their operational issues were becoming critical. Several advisors had specifically recommended my expertise, and she hoped I could prioritize their situation given the family connection that she now suddenly remembered to mention explicitly. I deleted that email without responding, returning to a conference call with a hospital system in Phoenix, but 2 days later, my assistant Jennifer knocked on my office door with an expression that was half amused and half concerned, telling me that I'd had 3 phone calls that morning from the same number. A Patricia Whitmore who said it was urgent business and kept asking when I'd be available to speak with her personally, and Jennifer wanted to know whether she should continue taking messages or whether there was some issue that needed addressing. I felt a flush of something that wasn't quite satisfaction but was close. The recognition that Patricia's situation had apparently deteriorated from seeking consultation to desperately needing help in the span of 9 days. That the woman who'd felt comfortable snapping at me in front of wedding guests and never bothering to thank me for hours of unpaid labor now felt entitled to call my office repeatedly and expect immediate access to my time and expertise. I told Jennifer to continue taking messages, that I would respond when my schedule permitted, and I could see her curious expression as she nodded and left, clearly wondering what the backstory was behind this persistent caller, but too professional to ask directly. That afternoon brought another email, shorter and more plainly written, saying that their business was facing serious compliance deadlines and competitive pressures, that Richard had been told by multiple sources that I was the best consultant in the region for their specific needs, and that she was really hoping we can connect soon to discuss how you might be able to help us, help family, during this difficult time. The last phrase inserted with a transparency that would have been touching if it weren't coming from someone who'd spent decades making clear that family obligation only ran in one direction. I sat with my laptop open, cursor hovering over the reply button, feeling the full complexity of this moment. The vindication of being needed by someone who'd dismissed me, the anger at the presumption that I'd simply help because family, the bitter recognition that Patricia valued me now, only because I had something she wanted, and underneath it all, a deeper question about what kind of person I wanted to be in this situation, whether I would use this leverage for petty revenge, or whether I could find a response that honored both my professional integrity and my own sense of justice. I called Marcus Chen, my former dissertation advisor who'd become a trusted mentor, and spent an hour talking through the situation, the history, the current request, and what I was feeling, and he listened carefully before offering perspective that helped clarify my thinking. I didn't owe Patricia personal forgiveness or family warmth, but I did owe myself the integrity of treating this as what it was, a professional engagement that should be handled professionally, regardless of personal history, with appropriate boundaries and fair compensation that reflected my actual worth, rather than family discount expectations. That conversation helped me understand that my response shouldn't be about punishing Patricia, but about asserting my value and maintaining my professional standards, about treating myself with the respect she'd failed to show and establishing terms that reflected reality, rather than the distorted family dynamics she'd always imposed. I drafted my response email on a Thursday evening after my last client call of the day, taking care to structure it exactly as I would for any professional client inquiry, with clear terms and appropriate boundaries that reflected my actual market value, rather than any family relationship considerations. The email was brief and professionally cordial. I acknowledged receipt of her consultation request, confirmed that I did provide the services she was seeking, and outlined my standard engagement terms, which included my hourly rate of $500 per hour, with a minimum commitment of 40 hours for the comprehensive supply chain and regulatory compliance assessment she'd described. A formal consulting contract that would need to be executed before work commenced, and payment of the full minimum fee of $20,000 required up front before I would schedule the initial assessment visit. I noted that my current client commitments would make me unavailable to begin new projects for approximately 6 weeks, but that I could tentatively hold time in my schedule if she wanted to proceed under these terms, and I attached my standard consulting agreement as a PDF for her review. I read the email 3 times before sending it, making sure the tone was neither warm nor cold, but simply professional, the kind of response I sent to corporate clients regularly, because what Marcus had helped me understand was that this needed to be treated as exactly what it was: a business transaction with a client who happened to be related to me, not a family favor or an opportunity for revenge, but a professional engagement with appropriate compensation and boundaries. I clicked send and felt something settle in my chest, a clarity that came from asserting my actual worth in concrete financial terms rather than accepting the diminished value Patricia had always assigned me. Her response arrived within 2 hours, and I could feel the shock radiating through the professional language she'd tried to maintain. She'd had no idea my fees were so high. She'd assumed as family we could work out something more reasonable. Surely I understood that helping family was different from working with corporate clients. And couldn't we discuss a more flexible arrangement that took into account their current financial pressures and our relationship? I felt a flash of anger at that word flexible, recognizing it as the same dynamic that had always governed our interactions. The assumption that I should bend and accommodate and provide my labor and time and expertise at a discount, or for free, because family obligation only ever seemed to flow in one direction. I waited until the next morning to respond, keeping my reply even shorter. These were my standard industry rates, which reflected my expertise and market value. I didn't offer family discounts for professional services, and the terms I'd outlined were non-negotiable, but I understood if they preferred to seek consultation elsewhere and wished them well in finding an appropriate advisor for their needs. I meant that last part genuinely, recognizing that I would feel no guilt whatsoever if they chose to work with someone else, because I'd finally internalized what I should have known all along. My worth wasn't determined by whether Patricia valued me, and I didn't need her validation or her business to know what I was capable of providing. Patricia's response to my polite but firm reiteration of terms took 3 days to arrive, and when it did, it came not from her email address, but from a corporate account belonging to Richard Whitmore, her husband, whom I'd met perhaps half a dozen times over the years at family gatherings, where he'd been pleasant enough in that distant way wealthy men have with relatives they don't consider important enough to remember properly. His email was more carefully constructed than Patricia's had been, opening with acknowledgement of my professional accomplishments that he'd recently learned about, expressing genuine respect for the reputation I'd apparently built in the supply chain compliance field, and explaining the serious challenges their import business was facing with new regulatory requirements and competitive pressures that threatened contracts they'd held for years. The tone was considerably more respectful than anything Patricia had sent, but the underlying assumption was still there in the closing paragraphs. Surely, given our family connection, I could understand their current financial constraints. Perhaps we could discuss a payment plan rather than the full amount up front, and would I be willing to prioritize their assessment, given the urgency of their compliance deadlines, even if they couldn't quite meet the 6-week timeline I'd proposed. I read the email twice, recognizing the strategy of having Richard reach out directly as both a way to bypass whatever personal tension existed between Patricia and me, and an attempt to approach this as one business professional to another, man to man as it were, and I felt that familiar tug of socialized obligation trying to assert itself. The voice that said, maybe I should be flexible, maybe I should help family even if they'd never helped me. Maybe I was being petty by holding firm on terms that did seem high when I really thought about it. But then I remembered standing in that country club service corridor fighting back tears while my feet ached and my aunt's casual cruelty echoed in my ears, remembered the years of dismissal and comparison and being made to feel less than. And I understood with perfect clarity that this wasn't about revenge or pettiness, but about finally, definitively, establishing that my worth was real and non-negotiable, and not subject to family discount, simply because Patricia had never bothered to see it before she needed something from me. I responded to Richard with the same professional courtesy he'd shown me, thanking him for reaching out and acknowledging the challenges he'd described, but reiterating that my terms reflected standard industry rates for the comprehensive assessment they needed, that the upfront payment requirement was my policy for all new client engagements regardless of relationship, and that my current project commitments genuinely prevented me from beginning new work any sooner than the timeline I'd indicated, though I understood if they needed to pursue other consulting options given their urgent deadlines. I kept the email brief and courteous, offering no opening for further negotiation but also no hostility, just the clear boundary of a professional who knew exactly what her time and expertise were worth. 2 days later, Jennifer buzzed my office to say that Richard Whitmore was on the line, and would I like to take the call, and I felt my heart rate increase slightly as I told her to put him through, wondering what this escalation meant, and preparing myself to hold firm against whatever personal appeal he might make. Richard's voice was warm when I answered, thanking me for taking his call, and he spent the first few minutes asking about my work and expressing what seemed like genuine interest in my professional journey, the kind of conversation we'd never had during those brief family gatherings because I'd never been worth his attention before, and I responded politely while waiting for him to reach the actual point of his call. When he finally pivoted to discussing their business needs, his tone remained respectful, but I could hear the assumption underneath it, the expectation that surely once we talked person to person, I would see my way to being more flexible about terms, particularly regarding the payment timeline, and the possibility of moving their project up in my queue, given what he termed the family aspect of the situation. I let him finish his full pitch before responding, keeping my voice calm and professional as I explained that I understood their situation was urgent, but that I had contractual commitments to current clients that I couldn't ethically shortchange, that my fee structure and payment terms were consistent across all engagements and reflected the market value of specialized expertise, and that while I appreciated the family connection, I'd learned that maintaining clear professional boundaries actually served everyone better in business relationships regardless of personal ties. There was a long pause on the line, and I could almost feel Richard recalibrating his approach, recognizing perhaps that I wasn't going to bend the way he'd expected, and when he spoke again, his tone had shifted to something more resigned, asking if I could at least send over the contract documents so they could review the specific terms and discuss internally whether they could meet the requirements I'd outlined. I agreed immediately, professional and courteous, saying I'd have Jennifer send the standard consulting agreement within the hour and that I'd be happy to answer any questions about the scope of work or deliverables once they'd reviewed it. And we ended the call with the kind of polite formality that masked the fundamental shift in our relationship dynamic. I was no longer the dismissed relative, but the expert consultant they needed badly enough to meet on my terms. The signed contract arrived in my email 4 days later with a wire transfer confirmation for $20,000, and I sat looking at the payment notification, feeling something that wasn't quite triumph, but was close. The concrete validation that my expertise had quantifiable worth that even Patricia and Richard couldn't dismiss or minimize, that I had built something real and valuable, entirely independent of their recognition or approval. I arrived at Patricia and Richard's house on a Tuesday morning in late October, exactly 6 weeks after the contract had been signed, driving up to the sprawling colonial in the affluent suburb that I'd visited countless times throughout my life, but never under circumstances remotely like these. The house looked exactly as I remembered it: pristine landscaping and that circular driveway with the fountain centerpiece that had always seemed excessive to me. But I was seeing it all through different eyes now, pulling up in my leased Mercedes rather than my old college Honda, carrying a leather portfolio case that held my tablet and assessment materials rather than arriving empty-handed and diminished. Patricia opened the door herself before I could ring the bell, and the expression on her face was so complex I almost felt sorry for her. Anxiety and forced pleasantness struggling against what looked like residual resentment that she needed me at all, that the niece she'd treated as servant help was now the expert consultant she was paying $20,000 to save their business. She'd dressed carefully for this meeting, I noticed. Not the casual, expensive athleisure she usually wore around the house, but actual business attire. A tailored pantsuit that signaled she understood this was a professional engagement, even if it was happening in her home. "Thank you for coming," she said, and I could hear how much effort it took her to strike that tone of professional courtesy with me, to speak to me as she would to any consultant, rather than the dismissible relative I'd always been to her. I smiled politely and stepped inside, greeting her with the same warm but boundaried professionalism I'd cultivated with all my clients, making it clear through my demeanor that I was here to provide excellent service, but that our relationship for the duration of this engagement was consultant to client, nothing more intimate than that. Richard appeared from the study looking genuinely relieved to see me, shaking my hand with real warmth and thanking me for making time in my schedule. And I could see he'd already set up their dining room as a temporary workspace with his laptop and stacks of files and shipping manifests that told the story of their supply chain challenges. What surprised me was seeing Vanessa there too, sitting at the far end of the dining table with her own laptop, and the look on her face when she saw me was entirely different from the smug superiority she'd worn at her wedding. She looked subdued, almost embarrassed, unable to quite meet my eyes as she offered a quiet hello that lacked any of her usual condescension. I acknowledged her with a polite nod and moved into professional mode immediately, setting up my materials and opening my initial assessment questionnaire, explaining how I wanted to structure our time over the next several days to gather the information I needed to develop comprehensive recommendations. Patricia hovered at the edge of the room like she couldn't quite figure out where she fit in this reverse dynamic, watching as her husband deferred to my expertise and followed my lead in organizing the documentation I'd requested, and I could feel her eyes on me throughout that first hour as I asked detailed technical questions about their import processes and regulatory compliance gaps and supply chain vulnerabilities, demonstrating the depth of knowledge that had earned me my reputation and my fees. The work itself was genuinely interesting once we got into it, the kind of complex problem-solving I'd always found satisfying, and I lost myself in the analysis while maintaining awareness of how strange this whole situation was. Sitting in Patricia's dining room, being paid handsomely to solve problems she couldn't solve herself, treated with the respect and attention she'd never given me when I was just her niece, proving through every question and observation exactly how wrong she'd been about my worth and capabilities. I delivered my formal presentation on the third afternoon of the consultation, having spent the previous 2.5 days conducting a thorough assessment of their import business operations, reviewing years of shipping manifests and supplier contracts and regulatory correspondence, interviewing Richard and their operations manager about current processes, and identifying the systematic vulnerabilities that had left them exposed to the new compliance requirements that were threatening their most lucrative contracts. I'd set up my laptop to project onto their large dining room wall, transforming their elegant formal space into a proper presentation venue, and all three of them sat facing me with an attention I'd never commanded in this house before. Richard leaning forward with focused concern, Patricia perched on the edge of her chair with barely concealed anxiety, and Vanessa taking notes on her laptop with an intensity that suggested she was finally understanding the serious financial implications of their business problems. My presentation was comprehensive and professionally structured, beginning with an executive summary of my findings before moving into detailed analysis of each major issue I'd identified. Their over-reliance on a single supplier region that created concentration risk, their outdated documentation processes that couldn't meet enhanced regulatory scrutiny, their lack of proper compliance monitoring systems, and their failure to diversify their logistics partners in ways that would provide resilience against the supply chain disruptions that were becoming increasingly common. I walked them through each problem with clear explanations of why it mattered and what the potential consequences were if left unaddressed, using specific examples from their own operations to illustrate the risks. And I could see Richard's face grow more grave as he recognized how close they were to losing contracts that represented nearly 40% of their annual revenue. But then I shifted into the solutions phase of my presentation, and this was where my expertise really showed, where the $20,000 they'd paid me demonstrated its value because I didn't just identify problems. I provided a comprehensive roadmap for fixing them with specific actionable recommendations prioritized by urgency and impact. I developed a phased implementation plan that would bring them into full compliance within 6 months while simultaneously strengthening their overall business resilience, recommending specific software systems for compliance tracking, introducing them to alternative supplier networks I'd cultivated relationships with through my consulting work, restructuring their documentation processes to meet regulatory requirements, and creating monitoring protocols that would prevent these vulnerabilities from developing again. Each recommendation came with detailed implementation steps, estimated costs, timeline projections, and expected outcomes, the kind of thorough strategic planning that Patricia had never imagined I was capable of when she'd seen me as nothing more than free labor for Vanessa's wedding. I watched their faces as I walked through the solutions, seeing Richard's expression shift from worry to cautious optimism as he recognized that the problems were serious but solvable, seeing Patricia's mixture of relief and what looked like genuine surprise at the sophistication of my analysis, and seeing Vanessa looking at me with something I'd never seen from her before, respect, grudging perhaps, but unmistakably real. When I finished the formal presentation and opened the floor for questions, Richard asked intelligent, detailed questions about implementation logistics and costs, and I answered each one with the confidence that came from knowing my recommendations were sound and based on extensive industry experience. Patricia was quieter during the question period, but I could feel her watching me with new eyes, finally seeing what she'd dismissed for so many years. And when Richard thanked me at the end and said sincerely that my assessment was exactly what they needed and worth every dollar of my fee, I felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with vindication and everything to do with having delivered genuinely excellent work that would solve real problems for a client, even if that client happened to be family who had never valued me until they needed expertise I possessed. After I'd packed up my materials and Richard had transferred the final payment installment that completed our contract, Patricia caught me in the foyer as I was preparing to leave, touching my arm with a hesitancy I'd never seen from her before, and asking if we could talk privately for a few minutes. Just the two of us. And I could see in her face that this was the conversation she'd been building toward throughout the 3 days I'd been in her home. I agreed, curious despite myself, and followed her into the living room where we'd had countless family gatherings over the years. Sitting down on the cream-colored sofa, where I'd once spilled juice as a child and been scolded far more harshly than any mistake warranted, Patricia sat across from me in the matching armchair, her hands folded in her lap in a pose that looked almost contrite, and she started talking in a voice that was softer than her usual confident tone, saying that she wanted to acknowledge that she hadn't always treated me as well as she should have, that perhaps she'd been dismissive at times, that the wedding situation in particular might have been handled better. I listened quietly, keeping my expression neutral, noticing how carefully she was choosing her words, how her apology was constructed to minimize her culpability, while still making some gesture toward recognition of wrongdoing. "I never realized you were doing such important work," she continued. And there it was. The implicit message that my worth to her was conditional on my professional success, that I deserved better treatment now because I'd proven myself valuable by her standards, rather than because I'd always deserved basic respect and dignity as a human being and her niece. She talked about how she'd always wanted the best for everyone in the family, how sometimes her high standards made her seem harsh, how she'd been under a lot of stress with Richard's business problems and perhaps hadn't been as thoughtful as she should have been, each statement a justification wrapped in the language of apology. And I felt remarkably calm listening to it all. Not angry anymore, but not willing to accept this halfway acknowledgement as sufficient either. When she finally paused, seeming to expect some kind of response that would let us move forward, as though this conversation had resolved everything, I took a breath and spoke with the same professional composure I'd maintained throughout the consultation. Patricia, I appreciate you saying this, but I need you to understand what the last few years have actually been like from my perspective, I said, and I walked her through specific memories with calm precision. The wedding where she'd made me work as unpaid labor while treating me as invisible, except when criticizing my service. The years of comparisons to Vanessa that had made it clear she saw me as lesser. The casual cruelties and dismissals that had accumulated into a pattern of making me feel worthless in my own family. I watched her face as I spoke, seeing her discomfort with this level of directness, her desire to interrupt or deflect, but I kept talking, not with anger, but with clarity, making sure she understood that this wasn't about one incident, or stress or high standards, but about a fundamental failure to see my inherent value regardless of my achievements or usefulness to her. I've realized that I don't need your validation or approval to know my worth, I told her, meeting her eyes steadily. I'm successful because of my own work and abilities, not because of any opportunities or connections you provided, and frankly, the way you've treated me over the years has been hurtful in ways that can't be fixed with one conversation now that you've discovered I might be useful to you. Patricia looked genuinely taken aback by my honesty, perhaps expecting gratitude that she'd bothered to apologize at all, and I could see her struggling between defensiveness and something that might have been actual reflection. I'm willing to maintain a professional relationship if you need my consulting services in the future, I continued, keeping my voice even. And I'm willing to be civil at family gatherings, but the kind of close family relationship where I make myself vulnerable to your judgment and criticism, where I accept your treatment of me as something I should just endure for the sake of family harmony, that's not something I'm interested in restoring unless there's genuine change, not just words but actual sustained different behavior. I could see that my boundary setting was not what she'd hoped for from this conversation, that she'd expected I would accept her partial apology and we'd move forward with everything smoothed over. But I'd learned too much about my own worth to settle for that kind of false peace, and I held firm as she processed what I'd said, her face showing the discomfort of someone unaccustomed to being held accountable by someone she'd always seen as beneath her in the family hierarchy. 4 months after that conversation in Patricia's living room, I received an email from Richard with the subject line, Implementation Update and Thanks, and when I opened it, I found a detailed progress report on how they'd executed the recommendations from my consultation, complete with metrics showing that their compliance issues had been resolved and they'd successfully retained all their major contracts while actually expanding into 2 new supplier relationships I'd connected them with. He thanked me again for the work I'd done and mentioned almost casually at the end that Patricia asked him to pass along her regards and her appreciation for my professionalism throughout the engagement. I noticed that she hadn't emailed me directly, and I recognized that as probably appropriate given the boundaries I'd set, a sign that she was at least attempting to respect the limits I'd established, even if genuine transformation was still a work in progress. Over the following months, there were occasional emails from her, always brief and respectful, asking how I was doing or mentioning family news without any of the condescension or implicit criticism that had characterized her communication for years. And while I remained cordially distant in my responses, I acknowledged internally that this represented more change than I'd actually expected from someone as set in her patterns as Patricia had always been. My mother told me during one of our regular phone calls that Patricia had been unusually quiet at recent family gatherings, quick to offer her opinions on everyone else's choices, and that she'd mentioned me several times with what sounded like genuine pride when other relatives asked about my career, a shift that my mother seemed to find both surprising and encouraging, even as she carefully avoided pressuring me to reconcile more fully. I felt satisfied hearing this, but not vindicated in any triumphant way, because I'd learned through this entire experience that my worth had never actually been dependent on Patricia's recognition, that the value I brought to my work and my relationships had existed all along regardless of whether she could see it, and that the real victory wasn't in changing her perception of me, but in fully understanding and claiming my own inherent worth independent of anyone else's validation. My life continued to flourish in ways that had nothing to do with my extended family dynamics. I was promoted again to principal consultant with a salary that had reached $285,000. I'd been invited to co-author a textbook on international trade compliance that would establish me as a thought leader in my field. I'd developed friendships with colleagues who valued me for who I actually was, rather than how I could serve their needs. And I'd started dating someone I met at an industry conference, who appreciated both my professional accomplishments and the qualities that had nothing to do with career success. On the afternoon I signed the textbook contract, sitting in my apartment with sunlight streaming through the windows of the home I'd created entirely through my own efforts. I thought back to that humiliating day at Vanessa's wedding, when I'd served drinks to relatives who barely acknowledged my presence, and I felt profound gratitude, not for the suffering itself, but for how it had clarified what I would and wouldn't accept in my life going forward. How it had taught me that the most important recognition I could ever receive was the recognition I gave myself, and how it had ultimately led me to build a life defined not by others' limited perceptions, but by my own understanding of who I was and what I deserved. I never did return to being close with Patricia, in the way that some families might have reconciled after such a journey. But I found I didn't need that reconciliation to feel complete, because the peace I'd found wasn't located in any external relationship, but in the quiet certainty that I had always been enough exactly as I was, that my worth had never been something anyone could grant or take away, and that living well, authentically, successfully, surrounded by people who truly valued me, was not revenge, but simply the natural result of finally believing in myself as much as I deserved.